The wind was a sculptor of dust and loneliness, carving relentless patterns across the cracked earth of Ilara's land. It moaned around the corners of the small, solitary house, a sound so constant it had become a feature of the silence within. Inside, the silence was heavier, weighted with the memory of a voice that no longer answered. It had been a year since Jacob was laid to rest under the lone cypress on the hill, and each day since had been a testament to endurance, not life. Ilara moved through her chores with the grim economy of a machine built for a single purpose: survival. The sun rose, she worked. The sun fell, she slept. Her heart, she had concluded, was simply another fallow field, something she tended out of habit but from which she expected no harvest. Grief was a fine, gritty dust that had settled over everything: the rough-hewn table set for one, the cold half of the bed, the stark, empty space in her own chest. Fear was its constant companion, a low hum beneath the wind's cry, the fear of winter, of sickness, of the day the well might finally run dry or her own strength might finally fail her. She was standing at the edge of her parched vegetable patch, the handle of a hoe slick with sweat in her palm, when she first saw him. He was a flicker of motion at the far fence line, so thin and insubstantial he might have been a heat shimmer given form. A boy. He stood with a stillness that was both absolute and precarious, like a fawn poised to bolt. He wore rags that hung from a frame of sharp angles, his face smudged with dirt and shadowed by a wild thatch of hair. He did not move, did not call out. He simply watched her, his gaze a tangible weight from 100 yards away. Every instinct, honed by solitude and hardship, screamed at her to turn away, to go inside and bar the door. He was a stray, and she had nothing left to give. The pantry was lean, her reserves of compassion even leaner. Another mouth was a liability she could not afford, a drain on a well that was already perilously low. But she did not turn. She saw the hollows in his cheeks, the tremor in his stick-like legs. She saw in his unnerving stillness not a threat, but the last desperate stand of a creature that had been running for a very long time. The wind whipped a strand of her hair across her face, and for a moment, it blurred her vision. In that moment, he was not a stranger, but an embodiment of the desolation that surrounded her, and the desolation that lived inside her. He was a mirror. Slowly, deliberately, she let the hoe fall. Its clatter against the hard-packed earth was unnaturally loud, a crack in the vast, oppressive quiet. The boy flinched but did not run. Ilara took a single, measured step toward him, then another. The walk across the yard felt like a journey across a desert, each footfall raising a puff of pale dust, a prayer to a god she no longer spoke to. She stopped 10 feet from the fence, the weathered wood a clear line of demarcation between her world and his. She said nothing. Words were a currency she had lost the habit of spending. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable, and waited. He stared back, his eyes dark and vast, holding a history of hunger and fear she could only guess at. He looked from her face to the house behind her, a desperate, silent question hanging in the air between them. The stakes were laid bare in that shared gaze, his survival, her solitude. Breaking that solitude felt like breaking a bone, a painful, irreversible act. But letting him stand there until he collapsed felt like a different kind of death. With a sigh that carried the weight of the past year, Ilara turned and walked back toward her house, leaving the door hanging open behind her. It was not an invitation. It was a concession. The boy, whose name she did not know, crossed the threshold like a ghost passing through a wall. He moved with a practiced weightlessness, his bare feet making no sound on the worn floorboards. Ilara had placed a bowl of leftover stew and a hunk of bread on the table, then retreated to the far side of the room, busying herself with mending a leather strap that did not need mending. To watch him would be an act of aggression, a stare that might shatter the fragile truce of the moment. But she was aware of him in every other sense. She heard the soft scrape of the spoon against the ceramic bowl, a sound that started hesitantly and then grew frantic, desperate. She heard the ragged intake of his breath between swallows, the sound of a body starved not just for food, but for air, for life itself. When the scraping stopped, a profound silence fell once more. Ilara risked a glance. The bowl was wiped clean, as if licked. The boy sat hunched over it, his small hands wrapped around its empty curve, guarding it. He was not looking at her, but at the wall, his gaze distant and unfocused. His body was a knot of tension, coiled and ready to spring at the slightest provocation. He had eaten, but he was not at ease. He was a wild thing brought indoors, trapped by his own need. The day unfolded in this strange, silent rhythm. Ilara went about her duties, the boy a shadow trailing in her wake. When she went to the well, he stood by the barn door, watching. When she fed the chickens, he lingered by the fence post, his eyes following the scatter of grain. He did not offer to help, he did not speak. His presence was a constant, unnerving hum at the edge of her perception. She found herself altering her movements, making them slower, more deliberate, so as not to startle him. The house, once her solitary fortress, now felt like a shared cage. She saw things through his eyes, the sharp glint of a knife on the drying rack, the sudden shadow of a hawk passing over the yard, the heavy thud of the latch on the door. To her, these were the mundane details of her existence. To him, she realized, they were a catalogue of potential threats. The bruises were stark against the pale skin of his arms, faint yellow and purple maps of old pains. A thin, white scar cut through one eyebrow. These were not the marks of childhood tumbles, they were the deliberate calligraphy of cruelty. Someone had taken a tool to this child, had shaped him with fear. This knowledge settled in her stomach like a cold stone. It was one thing to pity a stray, it was another to stand witness to the wreckage of another's malice. It made her responsible. As evening drew on, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor, she prepared a small pallet of blankets by the hearth. It was far from her own room, a space that felt safe and neutral. She placed it there without a word, then went to stoke the fire. The boy watched her every move. When she was done, he crept to the blankets and curled into a tight ball, his back to the room, facing the fading embers. He made himself as small as possible, a tactic of survival she understood instinctively. Ilara sat in her rocking chair, the mended strap lying forgotten in her lap. The firelight flickered across his still form. The house was no longer silent, it was quiet. The difference was immense. The silence had been an absence, an emptiness. The quiet was a presence, the soft, rhythmic sound of a child's breathing. It did not fill the space Jacob had left, but it pushed back against the crushing weight of it. She did not know his name. She did not know his story. All she knew was the stark reality of him, a fragile life entrusted to her by a gust of wind and a moment of weakness. She felt a profound and terrifying shift within herself. The hard shell of her grief had been breached, not by a flood of new emotion, but by a single, insistent trickle of duty. Trust was not a thing to be given or taken, on this barren stretch of land, it was a crop to be cultivated, slowly and with infinite patience. The third day, a fragile shoot broke the surface. The boy began to follow her not as a shadow, but as an apprentice. When she went to the barn to milk their lone, aging cow, Bessie, he did not linger at the door but slipped inside, settling on an overturned bucket in the corner. The air was thick with the sweet smell of hay and animal warmth. Bessie, unperturbed, chewed her cud and flicked her tail. The boy sat perfectly still, his dark eyes watching the rhythmic pull and squeeze of Ilara's hands, the stream of white milk frothing in the pail. The silence in the barn was different from the silence in the house. It was a working quiet, punctuated by the cow's soft lowing and the hiss of milk against metal. Ilara worked, and the boy watched. There was a question in his gaze, a raw and unspoken curiosity. He was studying her, learning the cadence of her life, the shape of her labor. She finished milking and rose, her back aching. Instead of taking the pail straight to the house, she paused. She dipped a tin cup into the warm, frothy milk and held it out to him. She did not walk over to him, she held it out from where she stood, an offering that required him to cross the space between them. For a long moment, he did not move. His gaze darted from the cup to her face and back again. Fear and want warred in his expression. It was, she knew, a test. Not of her, but of his own courage. Finally, with the slow, deliberate motion of a creature approaching a strange hand, he slid off the bucket. He crept forward, his eyes never leaving hers, and took the cup. His small, chapped fingers brushed against hers. The contact was electric, a jolt of warmth that seemed to travel straight up her arm and lodge in her chest. He drank the milk quickly, his throat working, then handed the empty cup back with the same solemn gravity. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and, for the first time, a sound escaped his lips. It was not a word, but a soft sigh of contentment. It was enough. Later that afternoon, the sky turned a bruised purple. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and ozone. A summer squall was rolling in from the plains, fast and violent. Ilara rushed to secure the chickens in their coop and latch the barn doors. The boy, seeing her urgency, scurried to help, his small frame struggling against a heavy wooden shutter that had come loose from the window of the house. He couldn't fix it, but he braced his body against it, fighting the wind that threatened to tear it from its remaining hinge. She came to his side, her larger frame shielding him from the worst of the gusts. Together, they wrestled the shutter back into place and dropped the bar. They stood for a moment in the sudden dimness of the house, the first fat drops of rain beginning to hammer against the roof. They were breathing hard, their shared effort a silent conversation. The storm broke with a furious roar, unleashing a torrent of rain that blurred the windows and turned the world outside into a churning grey soup. The sound was deafening, a relentless drumming that vibrated through the floorboards. It isolated them completely, shrinking their world to the four walls of the small house. They were trapped together, two strangers bound by a sudden and violent act of nature. Ilara lit a lantern, its golden glow pushing back the storm's gloom. The boy sat by the hearth, watching the rain lash against the window pane. The fear she had seen in him before was gone, replaced by a kind of awe. He was not afraid of the storm. Perhaps its fury was a comfort, an external chaos that matched the one he had carried inside him for so long. She found herself watching him, the hard lines of her face softening in the lantern light. He was just a boy. A boy who had been hurt, who was scared, but who was also resilient. He had survived whatever had come before, and he was surviving this, too. In the heart of the storm, surrounded by its elemental power, the silence between them changed again. It was no longer a void or a truce. It was a space of shared shelter. The pantry shelves were growing bare, a stark wooden reminder that their small, isolated world could not sustain itself forever. A trip to the town of Redemption was a necessity, one Ilara had been postponing. Redemption was a place of hard pews and harder gazes, a town that measured a person's worth by the fullness of their harvest and the purity of their name. She had neither. Now, she had something else, a silent boy who was a walking, breathing question mark. Leaving him behind was unthinkable. He might vanish as mysteriously as he had appeared. Taking him with her felt like walking a lamb into a den of wolves. She made her decision in the grey light of dawn, her jaw set. They would face it together. She found a worn but clean shirt of Jacob's, one he had worn as a youth, and with a few quick stitches, she tailored it to the boy's slight frame. She washed his face and combed his hair with her fingers, her touch gentle but firm. He submitted to her fussing with a quiet stoicism, his eyes wide and uncertain. The journey was 5 miles by wagon, a slow, rattling passage through a landscape that offered little comfort. The sun beat down, baking the dust on the road. The boy sat beside her on the hard plank seat, his hands gripping the edge, his knuckles white. He did not look at the passing scenery, but stared straight ahead, as if bracing for an impact. Redemption announced itself with a church steeple and the barking of dogs. As they rolled down the main street, windows became frames for curious faces. Doors opened a crack. The usual hum of town life seemed to quiet as they passed, replaced by a low murmur of whispers. Ilara felt the stares like physical blows. They were directed at her, the grieving widow who kept to herself, and at the strange, silent child at her side. Her first stop was Miller's Mercantile, a place that smelled of sawdust, coffee beans, and judgment. Mr. Miller, a man whose face seemed permanently pinched in disapproval, eyed the boy over the top of his spectacles as Ilara placed her meager list on the counter. Flour. Salt. Kerosene, she said, her voice steady. Miller began to measure out the flour, his movements deliberate. Times are hard, Ilara, he said, not looking at her. Hard for a woman alone, it was not an expression of sympathy. It was an assessment. I manage, she replied, her tone leaving no room for discussion. See, you've taken on help, Miller pressed, his gaze finally landing on the boy, who flinched and tried to shrink behind Ilara's skirt. Or is it charity? The word hung in the air, thick and ugly. Before Ilara could form a response, a larger, more menacing figure darkened the doorway. It was Henderson, a rancher whose land bordered hers, a man who had made no secret of his desire to absorb her struggling plot into his own burgeoning empire. He was a bull of a man, with a florid face and small, greedy eyes. Well, Henderson boomed, his voice filling the small store. Look what the wind blew in. The widow and her pup, he smirked, looking the boy up and down with open contempt. Where'd you find this one, Ilara? Looks half-starved. You can't even feed yourself, let alone a stray. Ilara's hand, resting on the counter, clenched into a fist. A cold, protective fire she hadn't felt in years surged through her veins. It was a primal, shocking force. She stepped slightly to the side, placing herself more fully between Henderson and the boy. She met the man's cruel gaze with a look of flint. He is with me, she said, her voice low and dangerous. The words were simple, but they were a declaration. A boundary line drawn in the dust. Henderson laughed, a dismissive, ugly sound. For now, he said, his eyes glinting. That land needs a man's hand, Ilara. Not a woman's pity. He turned and strode out, leaving the scent of leather and arrogance in his wake. Ilara gathered her supplies, her movement stiff with suppressed rage. Miller watched her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. As she paid, her hands trembled slightly. The trip to town had cost more than a few coins. It had cost them their anonymity. Driving the wagon home, the silence was thick with the residue of the confrontation. The boy sat even closer to her now, his small shoulder pressed against her arm. He had not understood all the words, but he had understood the tone, the threat. He had seen her stand for him. In the harsh light of the afternoon sun, Ilara felt the fragile shoot of trust they had cultivated put down a deeper, stronger root, anchored in the shared soil of defiance. The ugliness of the town clung to them like the dust of the road. Henderson's words echoed in the quiet of the farm, a poison seeping into the air. That land needs a man's hand. The insult was a challenge, a spark thrown onto the dry tinder of Ilara's pride. She looked at her property not with the weary eyes of a widow, but with the defiant gaze of a defender. Her gaze fell upon the far corner of the lower pasture, a half-acre of land choked with rocks and stubborn, thorny brush. Jacob had always meant to clear it, to turn it into a new field for planting. One day, he would say, that'll be our cornfield, but his cough had worsened, his strength had failed, and the patch had remained a monument to unfinished dreams, a symbol of their slow decline. Now, it looked like a battlefield. And Ilara needed a victory. The next morning, she was out at sunrise, armed with a pickaxe, a shovel, and a grim determination. The work was brutal. The earth was baked hard as stone, and the rocks were deeply embedded, clutched by a web of ancient roots. Each swing of the pickaxe sent a jarring shock up her arms. Sweat stung her eyes and plastered her hair to her forehead. She worked with a silent fury, each rock she dislodged a rebuttal to Henderson's scorn, each thorny bush she ripped from the ground a defiance of the town's judgment. For hours, she worked alone. The boy, whom she had started to think of as Silas, a good, strong name from her father's Bible, watched from the shade of the porch. He sat hunched, his knees drawn to his chest, a silent, worried sentinel. He saw her straining, saw the sheer, punishing effort of the task. He saw her stumble from exhaustion, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Then, something shifted in him. He stood up, his small face set with a resolve that mirrored her own. He walked not to the house, but to the woodpile, where he found an old, sturdy basket. He walked out into the sun-scorched field, his shadow falling beside hers. He did not speak. He simply knelt and began to pick up the smaller stones she had loosened, the ones that were sharp and jagged, and placed them in the basket. Ilara paused, leaning on the handle of her pickaxe, and watched him. His hands were small and uncalloused, and the stones were rough against his skin, but he did not falter. He filled the basket, his small body straining with the weight, and carried it to the edge of the field, emptying it onto a growing pile. Then he returned and began again. A rhythm was born. The sharp crack of her pickaxe breaking rock. The softer clatter of his hands gathering stones. Swing and gather. Loosen and clear. They worked side by side under the relentless sun, a silent team forged in sweat and toil. They were no longer a woman and a stray, they were partners in a common cause. They were reclaiming this land together. They stopped only when the sun was high and fierce, sharing a ladle of water from the bucket she had brought. He looked up at her, his face smeared with dirt, his eyes clear and direct. In their depths, she saw not the fear of a hunted animal, but the steady light of purpose. He belonged here. He was working this land as if it were his own. The work was a language they both understood. It was a conversation without words, a bond built not on promises but on shared effort. Each stone they removed was a piece of the past they were clearing away. Each foot of ground they reclaimed was a piece of the future they were building. As the day ended, they stood together, sore and exhausted, and looked at what they had done. It was not much, a small patch of cleared earth in a sea of rock and thorn. But it was a start. It was a piece of Jacob's dream, resurrected by her will and the boy's small, determined hands. The land did not need a man's hand. It needed hands that were willing to work, to bleed, to hold on. And for the first time, Ilara felt she was not holding on alone. The evenings had found their own gentle cadence. The labor of the day would cease with the setting sun, and the quiet of the house would settle around them, no longer oppressive but comfortable, earned. They would eat their simple meal at the small table, the space between them filled not with awkwardness but with a shared, bone-deep weariness. It was on such an evening, with the hearth fire casting dancing shadows on the walls and the crickets singing their nightly chorus outside, that the silence was finally given a voice. Ilara was cleaning Jacob's old hunting rifle, the familiar scent of oil and steel a comforting ritual. Across from her, the boy was tracing patterns in a dusting of spilled flour on the table. He had been looking at the mantelpiece, at the single, faded photograph that stood there. It was of Ilara and Jacob on their wedding day, their faces young and full of a hope she could barely remember. "Was he your husband?" The question was quiet, tentative, as if he were testing the air to see if it would hold the weight of his words. It was the first full sentence he had spoken to her. Ilara's hand stilled on the rifle. She looked up, meeting his curious gaze. Her throat felt tight. "Yes," she said, her own voice sounding rusty. His name was Jacob. The boy nodded slowly, his eyes still on the photograph. "He looks kind." He was, Ilara said, a wave of memory washing over her, so sharp and clear it was almost painful. "He was strong, too. He built this house with his own hands." She found herself wanting to tell him more, to give this boy a piece of the man whose absence had defined her life for so long. He loved this land. He said it was stubborn, but honest. "It gives back what you put into it." The boy looked down at his own hands, red and scratched from their work in the field. He seemed to be considering her words, measuring them against his own brief experience. He looked up again, his expression serious. "I ran away," he said, the words coming in a rush, as if letting them out before he could take them back. "From the county orphanage." In Rock Creek. Ilara set the rifle aside carefully. She gave him her full attention. "The man there. Mr. Abernathy, he was mean. He used a ruler on our hands. He said we were a burden on the county purse." He spoke in a flat, matter-of-fact tone that was more heartbreaking than tears. He was not asking for pity, he was stating a fact, explaining his own history. "They sent me to work for a farmer. For my keep. But he was meaner. He didn't feed me much. Said I was too small to earn a full plate." He swallowed hard, his small jaw working. "So I ran. I just kept walking. For days." Here it was. The story she had pieced together from bruises and scars, now laid bare in his own simple, devastating words. He had not run toward anything, he had been running from a world that saw him only as a burden or a tool. Ilara's heart ached with a fierce, protective anger. All the world had given this child was cruelty, and still, he had found the strength to keep walking. Still, he had found the courage to stand in her field and pick up stones. She did not offer platitudes or false comfort. She offered him the truth. "You are not a burden here," she said, her voice clear and steady. "You earn your plate every day." More than earn it, his eyes widened slightly, as if this were a concept he had never considered. That his work had value. That he had value. He looked from her face to the fire, then back. A single tear traced a clean path through the dirt on his cheek. He wiped it away angrily with the back of his hand. Then, he spoke the name she had given him in her thoughts, claiming it for his own. "My name is Silas." "It's a good name," Elara said softly. "It's good to know you, Silas." The fire crackled in the hearth. The space between them was no longer empty. It was filled with their stories, with the quiet dignity of their shared survival. The house was finally beginning to feel like a home. The fragile peace they had cultivated was not destined to last. It was as precarious as a new sprout in a late frost. The threat that had been a dark cloud on the horizon rolled in a week later, taking the form of Henderson's wagon rattling up their lane, kicking up a plume of arrogant dust. He was not alone. Beside him sat a pinched, severe-looking man in a dusty suit, a man who carried the unmistakable air of petty authority. Silas, who had been helping Elara mend a fence near the barn, saw them first. The color drained from his face. He dropped the spool of wire he was holding and darted behind Elara, his small hand clutching the back of her dress. It was the movement of a hunted animal seeking cover. Elara's spine stiffened. She placed a hand on his shoulder, a silent promise of protection, and turned to face the oncoming storm. Henderson pulled the wagon to a halt and climbed down, his boots thudding on the hard earth. He smirked, his confidence absolute. "Morning, Elara," he said, his tone thick with false civility. "Got some business with you. This here is Mr. Davies, from the county magistrate's office." Mr. Davies stepped down, adjusting his collar and looking around at the modest farm with an expression of deep distaste. He held a sheaf of papers in his hand. He began, his voice dry as dust. "It has come to our attention that you are harboring a runaway. An absconder from the Rock Creek County Orphanage." Henderson's smirk widened. "Told you I'd look into it. Property of the county, this one is. I have a friend on the board." He was very interested to hear about a boy matching this one's description turning up here. Silas trembled behind her. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice was cold and even. "This boy is under my care. He is not property. That's not for you to decide," Davies said sharply, brandishing the papers. "He is a ward of the county, assigned to an indenture with a Mr. Abernathy. By law, he is to be returned to a man who starved him and beat him." Elara's voice rose, laced with a fury she did not try to conceal. "That is an unsubstantiated accusation from a delinquent child," Davies dismissed with a wave of his hand. "The law is the law. We are here to retrieve him." Henderson stepped forward, his eyes glinting with triumph. This was not about the boy. This was about the land. He knew that breaking her spirit was the easiest way to break her hold on her property. If he could take Silas, he could take everything. "Now, you can make this easy, Elara," Henderson said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "Or we can make it difficult. We have the authority to search your property and remove the boy by force. Don't make us do that." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She could feel Silas's small body shaking. She looked from Henderson's greedy face to Davies's cold, bureaucratic certainty. They were the world that had chewed this boy up and spit him out. They were the fist of a system that saw a child as a commodity. She thought of the past weeks. Of the silent meals, the shared labor, the sound of his breathing in the quiet house. She thought of the cleared patch of land, a testament to their combined will. They had built something here. Not just a field, but a fragile, nascent hope. And she would not let them tear it down. The moment of decision was upon her. Give in, and return to her solitary grief, her life of quiet desperation, having failed the one soul who had stumbled into her care. or stand her ground and risk losing everything. The sun was high, beating down on the four figures frozen in a tableau of confrontation. The air was thick with the scent of dry grass and impending violence. Ilara felt Silas's grip tighten on her dress, a small, desperate anchor in a turbulent sea. She drew a slow, steadying breath, the air filling her lungs with the familiar grit of her own land. This was her ground. She would not be moved from it. She looked past Henderson's sneering face, past Davies's official papers, and met the rancher's eyes with a gaze as hard and unyielding as the stones they had cleared from the field. "You will not set 1 foot past this fence line," she said. Her voice did not tremble. It was low, resonant, imbued with an authority that came not from paper, but from purpose. Henderson let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Is that a threat, widow? There are 2 of us. And we have the law on our side of the law." Ilara's lip curled in a slight, bitter smile. "You talk of law, Mr. Davies, but you stand with a man who has been trying to run me off my land since the day my husband was buried. A man who sees this boy not as a child, but as a lever to get what he wants. Does the law have nothing to say about that?" Davies flushed, his composure cracking slightly. "That is a separate and irrelevant matter. It is the only matter that is relevant," Ilara shot back. She took a half-step forward, shielding Silas more completely. "This boy came to me starved and bruised. He has worked by my side. He has found shelter here. If you want to take him, you will have to do it by force. And I promise you, this land will remember it." There was a wildness in her eyes, a ferocity that neither man had expected from the grieving, solitary woman. She was no longer just Ilara. She was a guardian at a gate. Frustrated, Henderson's veneer of civility vanished. He took a step toward her, his hand raised as if to shove her aside. "Get out of the way, woman!" In that instant, something broke loose in Silas. He darted out from behind Ilara, placing his small body in front of hers. He stood there, legs braced, fists clenched, a tiny, defiant warrior facing down a giant. "You leave her alone," he yelled, his voice cracking with a mix of fear and fury. It was the loudest sound he had ever made. The sight was so unexpected, so utterly startling, that Henderson actually stopped in his tracks. He stared down at the small boy, momentarily baffled. That split second of hesitation was all Ilara needed. She moved with a speed born of pure adrenaline, stepping past Silas and grabbing the heavy pickaxe that was still leaning against the fence post where she had left it that morning. She didn't raise it like a weapon. She held it low, its sharp point aimed at the ground between them, its weight familiar and solid in her hands. "I said," she repeated, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was more chilling than any shout, "you will not set foot on this property." Her stance was absolute. The pickaxe was not just a tool, it was an extension of her will, a symbol of the labor and the life she was defending. Her eyes burned with a cold fire. Davies, the man of paper and procedure, took a nervous step back. This was not the orderly retrieval he had envisioned. This was raw, elemental, and dangerous. He looked at Henderson, who was staring at Ilara, a flicker of genuine fear finally dawning in his greedy eyes. He saw not a helpless widow, but a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. He had miscalculated. He had thought he was kicking at a hollow log, but he had kicked a hornet's nest. Henderson spat on the ground. "This isn't over, Ilara," he snarled, but the threat was hollow. He turned and climbed back into his wagon, defeated not by force of arms, but by a force of will he could not comprehend. Davies, flustered, scurried after him. "We will be filing an official report," he called back, his voice thin and reedy. Ilara did not move. She stood there, the pickaxe held steady, until the wagon was a distant cloud of dust on the horizon. Only then did she allow the tension to leave her body. The pickaxe suddenly felt immensely heavy. She let it fall to the ground with a thud. The immediate danger had passed. The silence that descended after the wagon's departure was profound. It was not the empty silence of before, nor the companionable quiet of recent weeks. It was the ringing silence of a battle's aftermath, the air still vibrating with tension and unspoken emotion. The sun beat down, indifferent. A lone hawk circled high overhead. Ilara's hands were shaking, the adrenaline draining away to leave a deep, trembling exhaustion in its place. She turned and looked at Silas. He was still standing where he had planted himself, his small chest heaving. He had faced down his greatest fears: authority, cruelty, the threat of being dragged back into the darkness, to stand not just for himself, but for her. He looked up at her, his eyes wide and dark, reflecting the vast, empty sky. In their depths, she saw the echo of the confrontation, the terror, and a new, dawning awareness of what they had just done. They had won. Together. Slowly, she knelt, her knees cracking in protest, until she was on his level. She reached out, not to his shoulder, but to his small, clenched fist, and gently uncurled his fingers. His hand was cold. She wrapped her own larger, calloused hands around it, warming it. The world shrank to that single point of contact. No words were needed. Everything was said in that shared touch: her gratitude for his courage, his reliance on her strength, their mutual, unspoken declaration that they were now inextricably bound. They stayed like that for a long time, kneeling in the dust of their yard, while the world settled back onto its axis. Eventually, the sun began its descent, painting the western sky in strokes of orange and violet. The harsh light of midday softened into the gentle glow of evening. Ilara rose, pulling him up with her. "Come," she said softly. "Let's sit on the porch." They sat on the top step of the porch, the one Jacob had replaced the summer before he died. They watched the colors of the sunset deepen over the plains, the landscape they had fought for. The cleared patch of land in the distance was cast in shadow, a dark square of promise. The house behind them was a bastion, its windows glowing with the reflected light of the sky. The quiet returned, but this time it was a blanket of peace. The shared danger had burned away the last vestiges of their separateness, fusing them together. They were no longer a woman and a boy, a widow and an orphan. They were a unit. A fortress of two. Silas leaned his head against her arm, a simple, trusting gesture that spoke volumes. It was an admission of weariness and a declaration of safety. He had found his harbor. Ilara rested her cheek on the top of his head, his hair smelling of dust and sun. A feeling she had thought long dead stirred within her. It was not the passionate love she had felt for Jacob, but something else, a fierce, tender, protective love that felt just as powerful, just as true. It filled the hollow spaces inside her, not replacing the grief, but growing alongside it, like a hardy wildflower taking root in rocky soil. As the first star appeared in the darkening twilight, Silas shifted. He looked up at her, his face earnest and solemn in the fading light. He had been thinking, wrestling with the events of the day and the shape of his new reality. He spoke, his voice clear and certain in the vast stillness of the evening. "I want to be your son." The words were not a question. They were a statement. A choice. The deepest wish of a boy who had never been allowed to choose anything. It was the most precious thing he had to offer, the gift of his own belonging, laid at her feet. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. The simple, profound declaration hung in the air, more real and solid than the porch beneath them or the stars emerging overhead. "I want to be your son." It was the answer to a question she hadn't even realized her heart had been asking. All the hardship, all the loneliness, all the silent, grinding work of the past year suddenly coalesced into this single, perfect moment of grace. Her own response was not one of words. Words felt inadequate, too small for the magnitude of what was happening. Her answer was an action. She stood, taking his hand, and led him not into the house, but away from it, across the yard and up the gentle slope of the hill toward the lone cypress tree. The grass was cool and damp with evening dew beneath their feet. They walked in silence, their destination understood without being spoken. They stopped before the simple wooden cross that marked Jacob's grave. The air here was still and reverent. Ilara knelt, pulling Silas down beside her. She ran her hand over the weathered wood of the cross, a familiar, comforting gesture. "Jacob," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "This is Silas." She looked at the boy, whose eyes were fixed on the grave marker with a solemn curiosity. "Silas, this was my husband, Jacob. He would have liked you. He would have admired your spirit. She was not just making an introduction. She was weaving Silas into the fabric of her life, into its past as well as its present. She was grafting a new branch onto the family tree. She was telling her husband, and the quiet earth that held him, that she was no longer alone. That their home was no longer empty. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the cypress, a soft shushing sound that felt like a benediction, an acceptance. Silas reached out a hesitant hand and touched the cross, just as she had. A connection was made. A circle was completed. They stayed there for a while as darkness fell completely, two living souls paying respect to the one who had gone before, bridging the gap between what was and what would now be. When they finally walked back to the house, a new sense of peace had settled over them. It was a home they returned to now, not just a shelter. The next morning, Ilara woke with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. When she went out to the field to resume her work, Silas was there beside her, not as a helper, but as a partner. She handed him the smaller shovel. "This corner," she said, pointing, "we'll plant potatoes here. They're good for the soil." He nodded, a small, serious smile touching his lips for the first time. He took the shovel and dug into the earth, his earth, with a fierce and joyful determination. The narrative of her life had been rewritten. The protagonist was no longer a widow defined by her loss, but a mother defined by her love. The empty spaces of her world were being filled not with ghosts, but with the vibrant, demanding, and beautiful presence of a growing boy. The wind still blew across the plains, but it no longer sounded like a lament. It carried the sound of their shared labor, the ring of a shovel on stone, the sound of a boy's occasional laugh, bright and clear as a bell. It was the sound of a future being planted, seed by hopeful seed.